All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the FireAdapt webinar series. My name is Nuria Prat. I'm the project coordinator for the FireAdapt project. We would like to welcome all the participants. This is the second webinar of the FireAdapt webinar series that runs every last Wednesday of the month. For those who are interested in knowing more about FireAdapt, you can visit the website. It's fireadapt.eu, or also watch the February webinar, which was the first webinar. And Ima Oliveras, who's the FireAdapt scientific coordinator, gave a brief overview of the project. So, for people who are watching live, some housekeeping rules. We will ask everyone to mute your microphones. We're gonna have a Q&A session at the end, and you can do both. You can post your questions in the chat or raise your hand if you want to speak. So, with that said, I'll proceed to introduce Alice Hu. Alice is a final year PhD student at the University of East Anglia. She's studying prescribed fire and fire management on a global scale. She uses a combination of quantitative and qualitative methods to understand trends in fire management around the world, including shifts in prescribed burning weather windows and priorities for integrated fire management. In addition to research, Alice also enjoys doing science communication and outreach on fire ecology. So, Alice, it's a pleasure to have you with us, and I'll give you the floor for the webinar.
Cool. Thanks, Nuria. So today I'm going to be presenting results from the longest running chapter of my dissertation so far. And so this is basically on what fire management practices should be prioritized among the fire adapt countries using this method called the GPGI, or the Global Person Generated Index. So just a little bit of context. So I started collecting results for this chapter in like November of 2023 in the study hub in Mexico. And so that was just like a little bit over a year into my PhD. And I'm now in the final year of my PhD. So basically 2 study hubs and 3 online collections later, I'm excited to share these results with you. And I think some people probably also participated in this study, whether that was in Mexico or France and online. So just want to start off by saying a huge thank you to everyone who has donated their time and expertise for me to be able to do this study. And to all the study hub organizers, the hosts who let me squeeze this into a busy schedule, and everyone who helped me translate like consent forms, instructions, slides into Spanish, French, and Portuguese. And then lastly, a huge thank you to my lovely advisors, Rachel and Matt, for supporting me through all of this. And so, yeah. And so into the research, so a little bit into this specific method. So what exactly is the GPGI, or the Global Person Generated Index? So the GPGI it was basically a metric that was originally developed as a way to actually measure the quality of life in medical patients, but it has in the past few years sort of been extended to an environmental conservation context to measure people's well-being in different conservation contexts. So basically in response to different conservation measures. And what's special about it, it being person generated, it basically allows the person to define for themselves the metric that they want to use to measure what a good quality of life is. So it's participant defined, and they basically use that to determine what if their well-being is good or if their quality of life is good. And that bit is important because a lot of the times in conservation, people will use these externally defined metrics, things like, income or like literacy rate or some other economic metric to measure the effect of conservation measures on people living in the areas where they're being carried out. But the problem is that like these metrics are still useful and they can provide like this high level picture, but they might not actually be what the people living in that region consider important to their well-being. So the idea of the GPGI then is basically to allow people living in these areas, these affected areas, to define the metrics that their well-being should be measured by. And then in combination with actually letting them define what these metrics are, executing the GPGI also involves asking them how satisfied they are with this metric that they have defined and how important that metric is compared to the other domains that they might define as well. And so basically the way that this works is the first thing that you would ask a person when carrying this out is you would ask, what are the 5 most important things to you for a good life? And then you would have them either write these down or you would transcribe them. Then you would ask them how satisfied they are with these things at the moment. And then after that, you would ask them how important these things are relative to each other. So essentially, the GPGI can serve as this needs assessment because areas where you have low satisfaction and high priority are those are the domains that you should focus on for intervention. So then how exactly do we apply this to look at fire management then? So the way that I then applied this to fire management, so basically instead of assessing well-being or quality of life, here we want to assess the quality of fire management across fire adapt. So we want to consider what actions people, or we want to know what actions people consider good fire management that are essential for good fire management, and what areas, what of these actions should be prioritized for future research or intervention. So yeah, so applied here to measure the quality of fire management. So if you participated in one of my rounds of data collection, you'll probably know this process just as well as I do, but for those who didn't, essentially implementing the GPGI, these are the steps that I followed. So the first thing I did, which isn't displayed here, but the first thing I did was I first handed out a questionnaire for everyone to fill out. So information on who they were, where they worked, what the environment they worked in which they worked. And then after that, I asked the participants this specific question. So, in an ideal world, what are the most important fire management actions that you would implement in the region in which you primarily work? And then I have them write them down on these post-it notes, essentially. And then after that, I then ask them, I then tell them to, take a look at what they've written down. And then on a scale from -2 to 2, using the scale that I've displayed there, rank on this scale for each of the different statements they've written down, how satisfied they are with the way these actions are being executed in the region in which they work at the present moment. And so I have them then write those rankings down. And then the last thing is then I then ask them how important they think each of these management actions are, basically relative to each other. So the way that you do this is essentially you hand out these things that are called tokens. And so if you did the study with me in Mexico, that basically meant beans because that was what was in the grocery store. Or if you did this study with me in France, that means you used corn. If you did this online, it was basically like this boring little slider thing. But yeah, so essentially with these tokens, I handed out 20 of these tokens to every single participant. And then the idea is the participants then distribute these tokens among the different statements, where the statements that are of higher importance have more tokens on them, and statements that are less important have a lower number of tokens on them. So that basically serves as this importance ranking. So how did then my results look? So as I mentioned in the intro, I've been collecting results for like 2.5 years now. So I've collected responses from the study hub in Mexico, which was in 2023. Then I did an online collection after that, where I targeted some more responses in the Mediterranean. After that, I did another collection of results in the study hub in France. And then most recently, I collected a few more online responses from some of our colleagues in Argentina. And so basically from this, in total, I gathered 321 statements from 66 respondents and 10 countries. And you'll notice that number is not perfectly 5 because some people did not provide exactly 5 statements. Some of them provided fewer than 5. But yeah, so the figure that you see on the right is basically a breakdown of the respondents and what regions they primarily work on. So I'll clarify here that this breakdown, it's based on the areas where people said they worked, or areas that they said they worked on. So not necessarily where they are from. So for example, if there's someone in the UK that works on Brazil and that's their study area, then I counted them as Brazil for this chart. So you'll notice there's a slice in there also that's just the South America. And so that's because there were some single responses from Chile, Costa Rica, and Peru. And so those are basically all just represented in the South America slice. And then I also have a slice for people who, mostly researchers who study things on a global scale or like have studied things like in multiple different countries. So basically, after analyzing all of these responses, I came out with 11 themes and 41 sub-themes, and I'll discuss those a little bit more in detail in the following few slides. But just to kind of give us a quick overview on how exactly I analyzed these results. So basically, after I collected all of these statements and all of these little sticky notes, I translated them and then I digitized everyone's results into this Excel spreadsheet, along with everyone's information on the participant questionnaire. And then I put everything onto this digital whiteboard called Miro. Highly recommend. And then once everything was on Miro, I did what's called an inductive thematic analysis on the data. So the inductive part basically means that from the data, I looked for things that were sort of mentioned multiple times, and then I grouped them together. And then I tried to name the thing that was similar among the group of statements that I had. And so the first step of this is basically to take a look at the data and make my initial groupings and generate these things called codes. So these are basically like the initial groupings of things that are mentioned multiple times. And then after I've generated the codes, then I can start sort of bunching the codes together. So now I'm sort of trying to make these like bigger groups from the codes that I've generated. And so then after I've generated these themes and sub-themes from the codes, I then kind of as this like test of robustness or suitability of these themes and sub-themes, I then basically reapply those themes and sub-themes back to the original data. So then I look at the statements, I go through each statement again individually, and then I classify them into the themes and then the sub-themes to see and make sure that they fit into these themes and sub-themes that I came up with before. And this part kind of it's an iterative process. And so you kind of just like keep going through until you're satisfied and happy with the themes that you have. And so basically, as I go through the statements again, I might recategorize my stuff into different themes. I might rename my themes or remake different themes and sub themes. And so this is kind of that process of review. And then once I'm happy with the themes and the sub-themes I have, so basically all the themes and sub-themes adequately capture all of the statements to some extent, I then name and define them. So basically I give them a name that captures what exactly the statements in there describe, and then the sub-themes as well. And so this is kind of just a snapshot of what that analysis actually looks like. This is a screenshot of my digital whiteboard. So yeah, every time I ask people how many statements they think are on there, they think it's like 50, but that's actually all 321. So it's basically a lot of just like moving around those post-it notes and like reading them again, and then going back to the participant information and seeing if you contextualize it correctly and moving them back and forth. And yeah, that's kind of what the analysis looks like. So yeah, so then what did I actually find? So after the thematic analysis, so as I mentioned before, I came up with 11 themes and 41 sub-themes. And so these are the different themes. So these are those bigger categorical groupings. And so I'll just read through them really quickly. So intersectoral, institutional, and territorial coordination, fire suppression, rural development and economic policies, biodiversity and restoration, active landscape management, training, research and monitoring, public engagement and participation, participatory mechanisms, legislation, and then knowledge exchange. And so one of the initial interesting findings in this is that the most prevalent theme, so here when I say prevalent, I mean the theme that was mentioned the most frequently across all of the statements. So that's what I mean when I say prevalence, is this yellow one here, public engagement and participation. And so the top three most prevalent themes were that, the active landscape management, and then the research and monitoring. And so before I do a deep dive into each of them, I just want to preface this by saying that, of course, many of these themes are like really related to each other. And so they could be considered the means to the ends, for example. So an example of that is participatory mechanisms, which is that slicing gray. That could be considered a means or a way to achieve, for example, intersectoral, institutional, and territorial coordination, or training, for example, could be considered a participatory mechanism in and of itself. And in line with that, a lot of these statements also could have been put in multiple themes, but for the purposes of using the GPGI instrument, I had to choose a single category, and I had to, make themes that I thought best captured these different kinds of statements. And so I basically weighed more heavily on the means part of each of the statements, meaning if there were two themes that I felt like a statement could go into, I put it in the one that focused more on how someone suggested doing something, since the purpose of the GPGI is to identify priority fire management actions. So then with that clarification in mind, so what exactly are in each of these themes? So the way the next three slides are structured are, so basically, I'm going to have a series of a bunch of each of these circles, and each circle is basically going to represent one slice of that pie. So each theme in and of itself. So the percentage that's within this pie chart, so that 18% you see here represents the proportion of that pie that I just showed you on the previous one took up. So this is the biggest theme that we have, takes up 18% of those 321 statements. And then within this pie chart here are the sub-themes within this theme and how prevalent they are within this theme. And so the legend is color coded to make it based on the prevalence of the sub-theme. So basically, the darker it is, the more it's mentioned within that specific theme. So getting started into this. So in public engagement and participation, the specific sub-themes within this one were changing the public or societal attitude towards fire. And so a lot of statements in this mention things like trying to emphasize to the public and to society writ large that fire is not always a bad thing, and it's something that's also inevitable and that we have to learn to live with. And the second one is public participation in prevention and management. And so I feel like there's one good quote in here that I feel like kind of captures the essence of this. And so it's this idea of like shifting from civil protection to civil prevention. So kind of instead of going from having civil protection where you basically rely on this agency's response to like suppress a fire, you're going to people actually participating in their own prevention of like being affected by a catastrophic fire. Yeah. And then after that, we have like outreach to land users. So basically outreach specifically to people who might be using the land. And so those are the three sub-themes within this theme. And then next we have active landscape management. And so this included things like, so fuel management. So the most named fuel management technique was prescribed fire, but it's not exclusive to that. And so a lot of these statements were saying that we need to either carry out fuel management or expand current fuel management. The second one that was mentioned was this idea of creating a landscape mosaic. And so this was proposed through a number of different ideas. So some people mentioned the implementation of fuel breaks. Another statement mentioned like creating like infrastructure on the landscape. So things like roads, or also strategic management areas and grazing areas. And then another sub-theme within here is post-fire management. So making sure you do proper restoration after a fire if necessary. A few statements mentioned controlling urban expansion, and then a few other statements also mentioned implementing in regions where it is appropriate a let it burn policy, which I guess is passive plus active management, but yeah. Then the third most prevalent theme is research and monitoring. So the first sub-theme in here is monitoring and evaluation of fire effects. So this included both the effects of both wildfires and prescribed fires, and many statements in this sub-theme specifically were talking about the need for a systematic and consistent way to monitor and evaluate. So this could include things like having a consistent metric to use when trying to answer like specific research questions, or also just monitoring it at a consistent frequency. So maybe like a specific time after a fire or in consistent intervals after a fire. The second one in this category was the second sub-theme is fire ecology, regimes, behavior, and feedback. So specific things that people thought were important to research. So basically a better understanding of these aspects of the specific environments that they were working in. A lot of people called for interdisciplinarity when it came to research. So having studies on both ecology and all of these aspects of fire science and fire ecology, but also integrated with things like social science. And then a few statements mentioned the importance of doing locally specific research. So one good quote for this is based on our own fuels. And then a few other statements also mentioned the importance of having early detection systems. So this included both remote sensing and patrol. And then moving on to the next few themes and sub-themes. So this slide's going to be a little bit more dense, but yeah, so starting on this right-hand side, because this is the only way that these all fit onto one slide. So we have intersectoral, institutional, and territorial coordination. And so the sub-themes within here. So the first one is basically the same thing, sounds the same as a theme, but it was basically calling for open lines of communication between agencies, institutions, and stakeholders. And then the second most prevalent sub-theme within this theme was integrating forestry and fire management. And so Yeah, so a lot of these statements specifically mentioned the role of forestry in fire risk. And so that can be through things like slash. So forestry generates slash fuels. And then also there was like one statement that also mentioned how monoplantation, planting the same tree across the whole field also contributes to fire risk. So basically integrating forest and fire management together. The third one is having fire management with multiple objectives. So I'll cover this in the next one. But so this is similar to kind of the participatory mechanisms, but a little bit of a larger scale. So having different institutional objectives incorporated into fire management plans. The next one in this is some people propose having this centralized management organization where a bunch of sectors and institutions and organizations and agencies could all sort of come together to do fire management planning. And then a few statements also mentioned so social cohesion. So basically so this one is more related to organizing stakeholders with similar objectives. So for example, connecting farmers and shepherds with each other on the landscape. And then the last one within this was people called for the equitable distribution of resources. So things like firefighting equipment. And then next one on here, so participatory mechanisms. So within this sub-theme, this basically included basically having mechanisms for dialogue and consensus building among stakeholders. So basically creating meeting points and having facilitating conversations between people and their different needs and objectives. And then we have local capacity building, so training and resourcing local communities to carry out their own fire management or fire suppression. So things like local brigades. We also have recognizing, incorporating, or promoting traditional and indigenous knowledge into fire management planning. And then lastly, having this adaptive approach. So incorporating feedback from stakeholders and having flexibility within the fire management planning process to be able to change things as feedback is given. And then the next one on here is training. So the biggest sub-theme within this was basically training local stakeholders in fire management. Next one here was then training fire management and agency personnel in different things like fire use, but also just like land management, forestry management, and more advanced firefighting techniques. And a couple people mentioned also specifically training in backfiring. And then lastly, on this slide, we have legislation. So streamlining fire management bureaucracy was the most commonly mentioned theme within sub-theme within this theme. So basically, things like making it easier to register prescribed burn actions or acquire permits. But this also included things like having a state policy or standardization of fire response and fire use guidelines and regulations to basically clarify what you can do and when, so stuff like that. And then the second biggest sub-theme was improving regulations and enforcement. So a lot of the statements in this sub-theme talked about the inadequacy of current regulations and how laws are basically kind of broken without consequences. So there was like a need to improve that. And then a few statements also mentioned that there's also a need to regulate environmentally detrimental actions. So for example, like mass deforestation for agriculture. A couple people mentioned that there needs to be some depoliticization process where there was like a few statements in here that were specifically mentioning how protected areas are basically sometimes used as political maneuvers by politicians and the need to sort of get away from that basically. And then lastly, within legislation, support for local management by the government. So this one was specifically calling for specific laws to empower local governments to act and fund their own fire. Sorry, these are really wordy, but this is the last slide on this. So lastly, the last themes that we have, so rural development and economics. So this one covered basically things like, so there was economic incentives for land use. So this basically covered things like payment for ecosystem schemes and a lot of stuff for preventing land abandonment and increasing land use. So increasing things like agropastoral activity, grazing, agriculture, stuff like that. And then the other sub-theme within this was financial support. So financing actions like financing specifically fire management actions like prescribed fire, but also like fuel removal that might be, like thinning in some areas or brush control. One person mentioned that it'd be great to have this incorporated into, for example, the Common Agricultural Policy. And then next we have knowledge exchange. So this statements in this category basically we're calling for open lines of communication between all of these different groups of people, stakeholders. So between research and practitioners, between the fire users themselves, so within on a single landscape, between research and local communities, between research and policy, and then between research and the public. Then we have fire suppression. So statements within this category, we're basically talking about how they needed to have better equipment or resources for fire suppression. So things like trucks or tools or hoses, better compensation and recognition for firefighters, and then also the importance of actually carrying out combat. And then lastly, biodiversity and restoration. So statements in this basically addressed restoring degraded areas. So that included reintroducing fire to fire suppressed areas, reforesting with native species, or having some sort of soil management in basically areas that have been disturbed. And then there was also a call to incorporate biodiversity into management plans, so management for biodiversity, and lastly, nature-based solutions, prioritizing these in fire management as well. So yeah, so with all those themes in mind, so one of the things that I also wanted to investigate within the themes, and you might have thought this as I was like rambling on about all the different themes and sub-themes, was whether or not there was like a difference in the theme prevalence based on the different regions or the countries in the data set, because of course, fire and land management is super specific to not only the country, but even the locale. So my sample size doesn't allow me to look at things by country, but I can look at things by continent. And so I also did look at how the theme prevalence differed by Europe and Latin America. So these pie charts are basically the same as that first one I showed you, but separated out by Europe and Latin America. And so in each of these subsets, so there's 160 statements and 33 participants in the Europe subset, and then 151 statements and 31 participants in the Latin American subset. So it's a pretty even split, which is nice. So yeah, so these are the prevalence by theme differing by country. So I'll just quickly highlight some of the more noticeable differences. So the biggest difference is actually in this green slice, which is the rural development and economics. And this one is because when I was digging into it, looking at the different sub-themes and who mentioned what, I'm sure a lot of the people who have worked in this region are aware, and people in Fire Adapt are aware, that rural abandonment is one of the big drivers in a lot of the extreme fire activity in the European Mediterranean. And so the aspects of the rural development and economic support in that specific theme were related to having preventing rural abandonment, essentially. So that's why that one was more dominant in Europe, essentially. And then similarly, in the next biggest difference, which is this blue one, so active landscape management, a significant number of the responses in this theme were actually about managing the landscape to create this mosaic pattern. And mentioning that mosaic pattern was something that was almost exclusively made by European respondents. And I'm guessing this is related to the fact that this idea of the landscape mosaic, I think applying it to fire management maybe originated in Australia, but recently has been adopted quite widely in Southern Europe to combat like the fuel accumulation from rural abandonment. So basically, the idea of having different land uses on the landscape to prevent like this fuel homogeneity. So yeah, so that's perhaps why the active landscape management, it's the difference in these two sub-themes or in these two themes is mostly driven by that landscape mosaic sub-theme. And then lastly, the next biggest difference is in this pink wedge, so the legislation. And so if we were recalling from the previous sub-theme slide, so the most prevalent sub-themes within legislation were streamlining fire management bureaucracy and then improving regulations and enforcement. So within this theme, the European respondents were much more likely to mention the former, so the streamlining the fire management bureaucracy, while the Latin American respondents were more frequently mentioned the second one, so improving regulations and enforcement. And this could be due to the fact that most of my Latin American respondents were actually working in fire suppression. And so a lot of them were like firefighters working in like different communities, and they might have just been a lot more contact with the regulatory aspects of fire and land management. Or this could also maybe reflect the fact that Latin American countries have been transitioning from sort of this fire suppression centric policy to more integrated fire management perspective that allows fire use. So it might be reflecting the need for that transition and the inadequacy of the older laws into for basically the present day and the need for using fire now. While meanwhile, in some of the Southern European countries, I know there's like some established bureaucratic processes already for carrying out prescribed fires, but the ability of local communities to follow through with these processes or obtain these administrative permits is often prohibitive. And so I think that might be what a lot of these respondents might be alluding to in the streamlining fire management bureaucracy. And there is also a lot of heterogeneity in like the regulation of prescribed fire across Southern Europe. So that could also be a factor in this. And there's a few more differences that I've also explored and I'm still exploring. So these are a few of the other ones. So these differences in participatory mechanisms, research and monitoring, and fire suppression. But yeah, for time's sake, I won't go through that. Yeah. So yeah, okay. So now pivoting back, I know that was like, that's going to be like the majority of my presentation was presenting on all these themes and stuff. But so kind of now getting back to the GPGI instrument itself. So just a quick refresher. So one of the whole points of using the GPGI in the first place is to identify the domains that should be prioritized within fire management. And in order to do that, we need to look at the importance and the satisfaction ratings that the participants provided because it's the areas that that are rated with high importance and low satisfaction that we should focus on. So yeah. So basically what I'm going to show here is if we plot each of the different themes on a set of axes, where on the x-axis we have satisfaction, and then on the y-axis we have the relative importance, then in theory we're going to have these, we'll have these four quadrants where the actions falling into quadrant one should be the areas that should be prioritized, since this is where we have actions that are high importance and low satisfaction. So you'll notice on this plot, I also have like, we have satisfaction on the x-axis again. So the -1 means that they're not satisfied with it. And a positive number basically means that they have some level of satisfaction with it. And then for the importance, you'll notice I have the axes split at 0.2. And that 0.2 basically comes from when participants were asked to rank the importance with those tokens, those beans or corn. I gave everyone 20 tokens to split among 5 statements. So that 0.2 is basically from if they distributed their tokens completely evenly among every statement, then every statement would have 4 beans or 20% importance. And so that value basically corresponds to a rating where no action is considered more important than the other. So I've sort of set that as like the baseline importance. And so when I plot the data, so here what I've done is I plotted the data based on the average importance and satisfaction for all the statements within a theme. So the number of statements within a theme is represented by the size of the bubble, and then the average satisfaction or importance is kind of where it sits on the axes. So you can see from this plot that it's not very well distinguished. So it seems basically that a lot of these points are clustered around that 0.2, which means that most people essentially just thought that all the actions that they were mentioning were more or less equally important. And you'll also notice that there was basically, on average, most people were pretty dissatisfied with how these actions were being implemented. And I think that's more of because of how I asked the question, which was I had people compare it to the ideal world. And so when you ask people how they compare things to the ideal world, generally they're not going to be satisfied because we do not live in an idealized world, alas. But yeah, so we can zoom into the plot a little bit more. So if we zoom into this kind of pink square here, and we plot that out, we can sort of get a little bit more of a distinguishing between the differences between these groups. And so the bubbles that kind of more clearly fall into that quadrant 1, so that high priority area, are legislation, which is in pink, rural development, which is in green, participatory methods or mechanisms, which is in gray, intersectoral institutional coordination, which is in purple, and then fire suppression, which is kind of that small little one on high up in red. So as one might expect, so after doing some statistical testing, I basically found that the difference in the importance and satisfaction ratings between the themes for both of them was statistically insignificant. So that's basically saying that the differences in average importance and average satisfaction that we see between the themes is basically as probable as being from chance. So that was kind of an unfortunate part of this. So another thing I tried is, so because the differences in the importance and satisfaction ratings were statistically insignificant, I thought, okay, well, maybe I can combine the importance and satisfaction ratings into this sort of composite index where a higher priority essentially represents something of high importance and low satisfaction. So I basically made this formula up that it basically creates a value using the importance and the satisfaction rating. So it's a value between 0 and 1, where a value of 1 would represent something that is of high importance and low satisfaction, so i.e. high priority. And then I actually did this like weighting where then like I weighted it against the prevalence as well, because how often a theme is mentioned also has some weight to how important it should be. And when I do that, I get this plot. So basically, it changes the distribution a little bit. And so we can see that, for example, in Latin America, legislation, participatory methods, and um, the public education awareness and participation. Those are the three most important ones. But the most important ones in Europe are the public education awareness and participation, the rural development and economics, and then active landscape management. Unfortunately, when I tested the significance of this as well, it was also statistically insignificant. But I do still think that like the prevalence can still tell us a bit on, or it's a start of where we can start like, prioritizing different fire management actions, especially when we dig into the specifics of the subject. So that all being said, just to wrap up what we've covered today. So basically, I was using this thing called the GPGI, the Global Person Generated Index, as a needs assessment tool to figure out if I could identify areas where we should, or fire management actions that should be prioritized in IFF. And then kind of the big result is that public engagement and participation that was the most frequently mentioned or prevalent theme across all the statements. And this was true even when you broke it up into Europe and Latin America, and when you aggregated that as a whole. The prevalence of the themes did differ though between Europe and Latin America. And these are the domains in which they differed in the most. So rural development, active landscape management, legislation, research and monitoring, participatory methods, and fire suppression. And then the difference in the importance, satisfaction, and priority ratings between the themes was statistically insignificant, unfortunately. But nonetheless, the theme prevalence can still give us an idea of what areas to focus on. So yeah, with that, I will wrap things up. So yeah, I'll just say a last huge thanks to everyone who supported me while carrying out the study. Everyone, who responded, gave me their expertise, who helped me disseminate the survey, who helped me develop the survey. Yeah, it's been a really amazing opportunity and privilege to learn from everyone in FireDev. I'll go back to my conclusions.
Thanks so much, Alice. This was fantastic. Congratulations for your work. It's excellent. That's probably one of the research that has been carried out through FIRE that's more comprehensively involving all the countries, lots of FIRE participants and beyond. So congratulations on that. Okay, so I would like to ask if there are any questions for Alice or comments. Gianluca, please.
Alice, thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask you, just to be sure, so you did your interviews to all the participants FireAdapt. So it was a mix of practitioners and researchers, right? Or who were there were also people extra FireAdapt, and who were the stakeholders that you involved?
Yeah, so it kind of was confined to it's been actually like kind of a combination of most of my responses are like people who were in attendance basically like for the study hubs. And then so that did include some people who like it was mostly people in Fire Adapt, but like also some people who were like partners, or maybe not even partners, but like who are just like attending the study hub kind of as like invited guests. So for example, I think the majority of my respondents when I was doing this in Mexico, I don't think most of the people who I did this activity with would consider themselves part of Fire Adapt. But because they were firefighters who were in the TREX training, so the prescribed fire training that was being hosted within that study hub. But yeah, so and then I also had some people who did this activity who they were like I think like agricultural engineers who worked with communities in Mexico. Um, yeah. So yeah, it's kind of been like this combination of both. I do actually have like the a job categorization in my data that I haven't shown here. But that is something I was looking at to kind of like contextualize the different statements when they were a little bit more vague. I would say the majority of people were either there was also a big split between Latin America and like Europe. So Europe, the most common respondent was a researcher, but the most common respondent in Latin America was actually a firefighter, somebody working in fire suppression. And then in both domains, we also had people who were like, I categorize them as like forest or like agricultural engineers. So somebody who like isn't doing research, but like kind of works on the landscape um, in communities. And then one other category in there was like program coordinator, something like that. Which, yeah, if that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Related to this follow-up question, perhaps Alice, when you were proposing the themes and so on, I was thinking, do you think if you would ask or carry out the same activities now with same people, let's say, do you think uh, the answers will be similar? Do you think there is how do you say, a bias because of the situation and the moment, and if there was an intense fire season the year before, or
Mhm.
do you feel like external factors could influence the response of the people who are involved?
Yes, for sure. That's definitely something that's something that's like a kind of known caveat about this method is that like external influences do affect this. So like for example, if yeah, like you mentioned, if it was like an extreme fire year, then people are gonna like mention like fire suppression might be higher up on the priority list. And because I was doing this obviously within a lot of the study hubs, perhaps one thing that came up a lot more frequently was like prescribed burning and fuel reduction because that features quite prominently also in several of the study hubs as well. Yeah. So yeah, I think it's one of the quirks of like qualitative analysis is like things are very like fluid, both like temporally, spatially, and also just like even like looking at the results. The first time I did it around versus like now, like I'm also like a different researcher. Like I was like 2 years ago that I am now. I have like, more context and more knowledge now than I did when I was like first analyzing the results like 2 years ago. So yeah, I definitely think there are a lot of things that affect like these different like themes and these different yeah, the results that come out of this. And yeah, the best thing I can do, I guess, is just like provide the code manual. So that's something you typically do when you do a thematic analysis is you have something called the code manual that basically says like how you categorize everything and basically the kind of like the threshold for which like, okay, if a statement like mentioned this and this, I put into this category kind of thing. So the best thing I could kind of do is just like be transparent about how I did that and how I've moved things around. But yeah, that's definitely something that is something that affects the results.
Yeah, that's something that will always be there. So,
Yeah.
but there may be that some of your findings are very robust or have been there for a very long time and do not change to small or minor external factors, no? So
Mm.
things like public engagement legislation, unless there's
Mm.
a step change for some reason, it may be, no, that
Yeah.
this will still be there as one of the priorities or no or concerns.
Yeah. Yeah. Perhaps. Hmm.
Okay, maybe I have one last question, or perhaps something to reflect on, and is Fire Adapt's trying to put together all these people from two very distinguished regions somehow. No, you were talking about it, Europe and Latin America, but now we are in this phase at the end of the project that we are also finding lots of common things.
Mhm.
That both regions have, despite all the differences, all the history, traditions, culture
Mhm.
involved. And I think your work can help as well highlight all
Mhm.
these
Mhm.
commonalities, no? That
Yeah.
even though, so like the underlying factors may not be that different. I'm not sure, what would you highlight as these common aspects all across the different regions that you find, apart from the themes, obviously, that you found?
Oh, in terms of, I guess, like management practices?
Yes, and even the priorities, like what do you think, like if FireDAG would need to propose the prioritization of some actions all together, no?
Mm.
What would be like the common aspects that you find across your study?
Yeah, I guess like the big one, I guess I sort of maybe covered it in like I don't want to like, I feel like I might just like repeat myself. But yeah, like the public engagement and participation, that was actually ranked quite high. Like it came out as the most frequently mentioned thing even after I split up the two groups. And like so a lot of the things in this where a lot of people were basically trying to get the idea across that like to the public that like fire is not always a bad thing and it's something that like people need to kind of change their perspective on. And so, yeah, I guess like that's kind of like the thing that I've taken away the most from it. And then, um, yeah, I think a lot of people also, I guess one sort of like line I've also sort of, as I've been like, going through the results and like, going through the results and rereading everything is there's a lot of I think also emphasis just even across all the themes on like this idea of like kind of like local capacity building and kind of like building from like the bottom up. And that's obviously like, a very, I think that's one of like the tenets, I think, of like integrated fire management. And I think that's also reflected in like this whole public engagement and participation thing where like you want to get people like feeling like they have like a personal responsibility and ownership of the land that they live on. And then basically from that, that's sort of how we can get how we can achieve like integrated fire management where people feel involved and feel like they have a stake in what is happening. So, from public engagement and participation to like training like local stakeholders in fire use, I feel like that kind of this idea of like going like bottom up is yeah, something that is important as well.
Thank you. Very interesting. Any other question for Alice? In that case, we'll probably close the webinar session here. The recording of the session will be available on FireDAP's channels, both website, social media, so everyone can watch it or rewatch it afterwards. So once more, thank you very much, Alice, and we stay in touch for the following webinars in a month time.
Thank you, Alice.
Cool. Thank you guys.
Bye.